Hello everyone. I want to talk to you today about a serious case review in respect of a child who I will refer to as Baby W. I'll give you some background history, and I want to talk very briefly about the approaches to the review and some of the key learning points that came from the review and the analysis of practice and agency involvement. So this relates to a very young child, a newborn. She was only 4 months old at the time of her injuries. And it was a child who suffered subdural bleeding consistent with being shaken without an impact. This took place while she was home alone with her mum. At the time of her injuries, she had 2 older siblings and was subject to a child protection plan that had been in place for approximately 2 months. There had been some fairly considerable and historical agency involvement, primarily due to some antisocial and threatening behaviour from neighbours, and a number of concerns had also been raised about mum's threatening and erratic presentation towards some professionals, members of the public and family members. And this also included some concerns around alcohol use and possible substance misuse. Baby W's dad often struggled with his mental health. He'd been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactive disorder, and he often presented in quite an adversarial and challenging manner, which was unfortunately exacerbated by some quite significant and heavy cannabis use. There'd also been a number of domestic abuse incidents around the time of the baby's birth, which mum reported that dad was the perpetrator of. However, some of these had resulted in hospital admissions for dad, who reported that he had been assaulted by mum a number of times during their relationship. Prior to the child protection plan, Children's Services had been involved in a sporadic and intermittent way on a child in need basis over a number of years, with a number of assessments having been completed, which often resulted in no further action, early case closure, or a reliance on early help. Significantly, in 2 weeks prior to the incident when Baby W was injured, there'd been a serious domestic abuse incident resulting in dad being injured. And this resulted from a breach of the child protection plan regarding contact between the parents. So the analysis of practice focused on 6 key lines of inquiry. And those were the approach to domestic abuse, the quality of assessments, whether they were strengths-based, whether sufficient account was taken of drugs and alcohol in the assessments and planning, whether family engagement and non-compliance was addressed by agencies, the effectiveness and purposefulness of the child protection plan, and importantly, to what extent was the risk of abusive head trauma present in the minds of professionals. So the first line of inquiry regarding the approach to domestic abuse, there was an overwhelming reliance on the assumption that dad was the perpetrator and that mum was the safe carer. Now, this was often exacerbated by dad's presentation, which, as I've said, was often very challenging due to the complexity of his needs, and was also reinforced by some agency perceptions of mum, that she presented well and often had a children's best interest at heart. One of the findings was that there was a lack of due process regarding the domestic abuse incidents which took place around the time of Baby W's birth. There was no evidence of any multi-agency strategy meetings or discussions, and consequently no Section 47 inquiries were progressed. And I wrote that this was a significant omission given the child's vulnerability and was possibly influenced by a prevailing assumption that mum was a safe carer and therefore a non-abusive parent. And in that respect, the rule of optimism was at play. And when we think about the rule of optimism, we can conceptualize it in a way that states it's a tendency towards under-responsiveness, where strengths are focused on and data is interpreted in the light of an optimistic or over-optimistic view. When dad attended hospital during the month in which the baby was born with some significant injuries, this did not result in a domestic abuse response, which may well have been different if the victim had been female. And yet at the same time, despite the assumption that Dad was the perpetrator, he wasn't referred to any perpetrator support programs or support systems. An important element here was that there was a high gravity, very serious, significant domestic abuse incident that took place 2 weeks before baby W's injuries. During the period when she was subject to a child protection plan, it took place during the weekend, and it was not referred by the contact centre to the emergency duty service. Critical omission in the assessment to the initial child protection conference was also a lack of family history, which specified the number of previous referrals and assessments. These suggested that there were concerns regarding mum's threatening and erratic behaviours as early as 2015, 3 years prior to the injuries that baby W sustained. Contributions from baby W's older siblings' fathers were also missing and would have provided a more holistic perspective regarding mum's behaviours. Both fathers had previously expressed some fearfulness and anxiety regarding mum, particularly that contact with their respective children would be stopped if mum's wishes were not complied with. Key learning points were around the importance of family and agency history, child impact chronology, due process around strategy meetings or discussions, therefore Section 47 inquiries, and an over-reliance on self-reporting. The importance of consultation with all agencies who'd been involved was also referenced as being a key learning point, as were the importance of robust management oversight arrangements, decision-making arrangements for the contact centre. Second key line of inquiry was around the quality of assessment. So in addition to the points raised earlier, the review couldn't identify any assessment which explored the impact of adverse childhood experiences that mum had experienced as a young person, which included at least one period of being a looked after child. What we know is that there's considerable research which suggests that there's a close relationship between adverse childhood experiences and poor mental health and challenging behaviour, and that prolonged exposure to stressful or traumatic circumstances without the buffering care of a supportive adult can impact on functioning, impulse control, and contribute towards a defensive positioning and posture. It is positive that the review identified that at the time we were conducting the analysis, a pilot regarding a trauma-informed approach was being rolled out in the city. There was no in-depth analysis of Dad's mental health and the way that his complex needs were impacting on his presentation. And this was critical in understanding Dad's strengths as a parent, particularly as there was evidence and information that suggested that Dad was genuinely delighted that he was a new father and wanted to care for both baby and mum. The third key line of inquiry was whether drug use, alcohol use, or poor mental health, was sufficiently factored into the assessment and planning process. What we do know is that the relationship between substance misuse and child safety is well documented. There were concerns regarding mum's alcohol use and mental health raised as early as 2015. And often, whilst further assessments were recommended and sometimes undertaken, the case was often closed and services were provided on an early help basis. And this formed a pattern of intervention, often resulting, as I've said, in no further action, case closure, or an over-reliance, you could say, on the provision of early help services. The referrals regarding mum's presentation at school suggested not only concerns around mental health and ongoing alcohol use, but cannabis use and possible amphetamine use, which wasn't explored or followed up in sufficient detail. Information held by mental health services suggested that Dad was using significant amounts of cannabis and alcohol on a daily basis, and that his mental health was deteriorating rapidly, and that his mental health was also compounded by the fractious nature of his relationship with baby W's mum, particularly at the time of the baby's birth. The conclusions of the review was that alcohol use, substance misuse and poor mental health were not sufficiently factored into the planning and assessment process. The number of repeat referrals followed by case closure as a pattern suggested a superficial level of intervention compounded by parental non-compliance, a rule of optimism and a shallow level of analysis within the assessment process. Insufficient attention was given to the process of change. Research indicates that change is a complex and necessary process which takes time and also needs to be grounded in a robust conceptual theoretical model. The fourth key line of inquiry was around the approach or the approaches taken to engage the family and whether the issue of parental non-compliance was sufficiently addressed. There was evidence to suggest that mum was reluctant to engage with agencies as early as 2015. This included not following advice, non-attendance at hospital appointments, some threatening behaviour towards professionals, and asserting that it had been professional or agency involvement that had been directly responsible for her trauma and loss. In addition, mum would often become challenging when issues were raised with her at school. There was also information that suggested that mum would present differently with different agencies and at different times, and that she'd been telling professionals different stories. Following the domestic abuse incident that occurred just 2 weeks before baby W was injured, and that involved dad visiting the family home, which was a breach of the child protection plan, mum reported to school that dad could be allowed back in the house, which was inaccurate, untrue, and a breach of the plan. The analysis suggested that efforts to engage the family were at best superficial and didn't provide the time needed to address deeply entrenched patterns of behaviour. Planning wasn't robust and didn't address mum's resistance to agency intervention and the inconsistent way in which she was presenting to other agencies. Importantly, non-compliance with the child protection plan regarding dad visiting the family home did not result in any immediate action to safeguard baby W, and there was a considerable delay in convening a legal planning meeting. Engagement with wider family members was superficial and would have provided a very useful perspective regarding family dynamics and functioning. One of the findings of the review was that whilst wider family engagement is critical for keeping children safe, planning needs to be holistic and time must be allowed to enable sustained change. And in that sense, motivational interviewing provides particularly useful skills and concepts for reducing, firstly, agency contribution to parental resistance, and secondly, at the same time, maintaining a focus on the child's safety and welfare. And those of you who are familiar with motivational interviewing as a technique will know that it uses open-ended questions, it's affirmative, it's reflective, and it summarises without recourse to judgmentalism or a judgmental approach. Fifthly, the fifth key line of inquiry was around the purposefulness and the effectiveness of the child protection plan. In a number of ways, the plan was strong. It appropriately referenced strategies to support mum and dad in managing their mental health. It addressed a core issue regarding domestic abuse in the relationship. And there was a key requirement that dad was not to attend mum's home. However, it didn't provide a robust support plan for the parents, particularly in the context of caring for a very young child and 2 older siblings. Whilst this was exacerbated by mum's resistance to professional intervention and also the involvement of a wider family, it was something that was particularly lacking in the plan. One of the things that struck me when I interviewed mum in prison and talked to her about what had happened, and I asked her, I said, tell me what happened on the day. Where were you at? Where were you up to? And she described her actions, what she did when baby was unwell, and she said it was just a blip. Baby had been constantly crying and she just felt at the end of her tether, and you get a sense of a mum who had just snapped. And I mention that and labour that point in the context of the importance of a robust and adequate support plan for parents, particularly when they're caring for very young children and older siblings. The requirement for dad to attend mum's address was not adhered to, as I've just said, and the high gravity domestic abuse incident just prior to baby W's injuries occurred in the context of dad having spent the weekend with the family home and continuing to visit following that. The matter was addressed at a core group at the end of October. However, no immediate action was taken to safeguard baby W. There was a significant delay in convening a legal planning meeting. And consequently, at the time of the injuries, the matter had not been actioned. Although it's important to note that Dad was not present at the time that the injuries had occurred. So whilst there was a breach of a plan, on the day that baby W sustained her injuries, Dad wasn't there. It was also noted that there'd been a period of approximately 4 weeks between a domestic abuse incident that resulted in the referral to conference and the conference date without an interim safety plan. And as I've said earlier, the matter of the contact centre not referring the matter to the emergency duty service had not been addressed. The final line of inquiry was a question, and it was: to what extent was the risk of abusive head trauma in the mindset of professionals? Abusive head trauma, commonly referred to as shaken baby syndrome, often results in serious injuries. Research suggests that 2 years after injuries, 25% of babies who have suffered abusive head trauma will have died, and 40% will have a significant disability. It affects 24 out of every 100,000 babies admitted to hospital. 1 in 9 mums have shaken their babies, and 2 in 9 have felt like doing so. An inability to cope with a crying baby is one of the key reasons for carers losing control and shaking their baby. And learning from serious case reviews indicates that abusive head trauma features more prevalently in 2nd, 3rd and 4th babies. In that respect, the ICON national programme is key. I, infant crying is normal and will stop. C, comfort methods can sometimes soothe the baby. O, it's okay to walk away if the baby is safe. N, never shake or hurt a baby, is important. The message is simple, it's consistent, and it can be reinforced by different professionals at key points. So the information provided to the review suggested that abusive head trauma was not present in the mindset of professionals across the partnership. Mum was often very well presented and appeared to have her children's best interest at heart, at least to some professionals such as the GP and the health visitor. There was no information that baby W was causing undue stress, and there was information to suggest that both mum and baby were thriving. All these factors mitigated against the consideration that abusive head trauma could be a possibility. So there are a number of key recommendations that flowed from the review. The importance of assessment and planning in considering agency history, family history, the importance of child impact chronologies, beware a reliance or an over-reliance on self-reporting, the assumption regarding domestic abuse perpetrators and victims was critical in this, the issue of parental resistance and non-engagement, the value of wider family involvement in the assessment and planning process, the importance of robust family support plans, the importance of safety planning, particularly between the conclusion of a Section 47 inquiry and the convening of an initial child protection conference, timely contingency planning, particularly where there are breaches in the plan, as I've already discussed, and alternative arrangements for contact where domestic abuse is a feature. The importance of a conceptual model for change, recognising that change takes time and resource and takes place within the context of a trusting and grounded relationship. The importance of a trauma approach to interventions, particularly where there's evidence of adverse childhood experiences. The importance of concepts such as motivational interviewing, the value of the ICON approach, the importance of robust management arrangements in the contact centre, and the importance, critically, of timely safeguarding processes such as strategy meetings and Section 47 inquiries. I know that's been very quick and we've moved through a lot of information, but there's some very key issues there in terms of practice. There is a handout that I've done with this. I'm hoping that you might have access to that, so you'll be able to refer to that in your lines of work or day-to-day practice. Can I just say thank you for listening? I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in a real sense, so we've had to do it virtually. And I wish you all the very best in your work going forward. Many thanks. Bye bye now.